everyone. Welcome to the Newburytown Library. I'm Dorothy Moynihan, the Assistant Director here. Thanks for coming out. Tonight we're going to be listening to Eric Fisher talk about his book that he wrote. He's on WBZ. You've probably seen it before. And we want to give a thanks to the Friends of the Newburytown Library for sponsoring this program. If you're interested in becoming a friend of the library, there's some brochures over on that table over there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for making the trip out. Again, my name is Eric Fisher. I'm over at WBZ Channel 4. I assume, hopefully, everyone has watched it at least once that's in the room, but you never know. If you haven't, we'd love to have you. Stop on by and check us out. I've got a little bit of a lead this evening to be able to come out and talk to you. So Sarah Robleski's home down the 4th, and I'll be back for the late news if you're up at 11 later on tonight. So I better a little bit about me first, I guess, just so I'm not a stranger walking in the door for everybody. I am from Massachusetts originally, so I grew up out in Western Mass. More small town, west of Springfield, kind of close to the Berkshires. Was there after about 7th grade, and then moved into Connecticut after that. So it's all been about local to winter weather for me for as long back as I can remember. Even when I was a little kid, I don't know why, but I was just into it. I guess just spending a lot of time outside. My book covers were covered with storms growing up in school, and I have yearbooks from 3rd and 4th grade saying, "Can't wait to see you as a weatherman on TV someday." We just happened to work out. I got very lucky, and here we are tonight. The goal is always to get to Boston. And so very, very fortunate to work alongside some great people at WBC, many of which we've been there for a long time. So there's a good legacy to uphold there at WBC. The story of this book is a little bit interesting. This is the book. No one's seen it yet. It's very tolerant. It's not too thick, not too heavy. This book came about right before the pandemic, actually. The publisher reached out to me and said, "If you want to make this kind of a book, we're wondering if maybe you would be the author for it." I said, "Well, my experience in writing is putting out snarky tweets every once in a while on Twitter, but I suppose I could give that a whirl and make it a project." And right after I started writing, the pandemic began. And so all of a sudden, there's a lot of free time that showed up. So I was at home quite a bit, and it was actually perfect timing to be able to put something like this together. The one issue that kind of came up is I couldn't come to libraries. A lot of the research was all done online, going through some libraries online, newspaper accounts, looking through old government records, things of that nature, piece together some of the information on some of our storms. And so I tried to pick a few of each type of weather, and it's kind of like a gateway book into New England storms. It's not going to cover every single one, but if you were interested in some of our most notable storms, this would be a good place to start, and then you can kind of branch out from there. And there's a lot of great individual books about individual storms, some of which are showcased in this, if you really want to get in-depth on some of them. I recommend some if you're interested in that. I'm not going to talk straight for an hour here or anything like that. I do have a little bit of a presentation that I can show kind of a taste of what's in the book and kind of what I was thinking kind of going along with it. And after that, we'll just open it up and you can drive the conversation. How does that sound? Good? Awesome. Love it. All right, away we go. The mighty storms of New England, and I already screwed it up on the second night. We got a little bit of everything around here, except the dust storms, really. We get the hurricanes and the floods and the tornadoes and the heat waves and the fires and the blizzards and the coastal storms, and that's why this is the place to be a meteorologist. If you want to be a weatherman, weatherwoman anywhere in the country, New England offers some of the biggest challenges in the United States because we have such variety. And it's also kind of nice from our perspective because as soon as we get bored of one kind of weather, we're over it, things are changing. We're on to the next thing, different type of forecasting, a different challenge. I do like that part of forecasting here in New England, whereas other places just have a dry and wet season, or sometimes they just have a couple of storms here and there. We're always switching gears a little bit. I covered a little bit of this right off the top, but I grew up in Western Mass in Connecticut. I went to SUNY Albany, the state school in New York. A few of those schools do have meteorology programs. There aren't a ton. If you have kids who are interested in going to college for meteorology or atmospheric science, you basically in New England got Plymouth State, New Hampshire, Linden State, Vermont, which is now Northern Vermont University. You have UMass Lowell, which most of our team went to actually. We have some programs at Western Connecticut, and it's kind of it in southern New England, around the area. New York was a pretty close option as well. Then there's lots of big schools where you can specialize in different parts of the country and different types of weather. My first job was really lucky. It was in Springfield, Mass, which was right down the street from home. A lot of people end up going to Cut Bank, Montana, or Bismarck, North Dakota, or somewhere very far away, very small, to kind of figure out what the heck you're doing, and then bring it to a bigger crowd. I get to start close to home, which is also good because you get paid very, very little in broadcasting when you start out. So I got to live with Mom for a few extra years, which is right down the street, and figured out how to do this whole weather thing. And from there, I went down to the Weather Channel in Atlanta. It was a fascinating place to work for a few years. There we got to cover all sorts of weather. The job there at the Weather Channel, for me, I was kind of a road warrior. I used to go to every type of big storm. So our focus was different than local. Local, I like because it's the dialogue of every day. You know, our conversation every night is kind of the rhythm of how we're living our lives day to day in New England and how things are changing. It's kind of subtle. The Weather Channel is just, where's the next big thing, wherever it might be happening. Because the little subtleties don't get national viewership. It's more about where's our impactful weather story. So we went to the biggest blizzards, the biggest hurricanes, tornadoes. I was on call. I had a kind of like a go rack in my closet down in Atlanta where it was like jackets, waterproof gear, pants, boots, goggles, mitts, gloves, lots of shirts, whatever you needed, and just throw them into a bag whenever they said go to the airport. And you pack the bag and you head out to wherever you might be needed. Get to work with Jim Cantori, maybe one of the most well-known weathermen in the United States. Got to learn a lot from him and a lot of the other great meteorologists down there in a short amount of time. All right, what kind of chapters do we talk about in this book? We break it down to different weather types. I feel like you got to lead off with New England weather book with blizzards. Around the Boston area, snow is kind of our big season. It's our busy season, it's a high impact season, and I think it's what people think about as our worst weather, even if it might be not the most damaging weather. It's the thing that we see the most of that's really notable year to year. So we cover the blizzard of 78. Naturally, it's chapter 1. There'd be a riot if blizzard of 78 wasn't chapter 1 in there. So I tried to break it down into a couple of big snowstorms, some unique storms, and some ice storms. So we had big stretches of snow, one being just a few years ago in 2015, another one being several hundred years ago in 1717. While blizzard of 78 is the Boston blizzard of record, if you look more toward Connecticut and a little bit off to our south and west, it's the Great White Hurricane in 1888. So I put that one in as well. The 100-hour storm is the biggest storm you've never heard of. This was back in the 60s, several days of snow, record holder in New Hampshire, portions of Mount Washington. Really a fascinating event, not a powerhouse storm, but something that just kept on going and going and going. Then we have our out-of-season storms, the April Fool's blizzard in 97 and the Snowtober storm in 2011, and a couple of big, pretty recent ice storms are in here as well. 78 is the kind of gold standard still. It was a big season. It was something that had a really high impact. And to me, the big storms bring in all the elements of a coastal system. A lot of snow does not make it a big storm per se. For example, look at last January. We had a big snowfall. Tons of snow with that storm. What else? There weren't any power outages. There weren't really any flooding issues. Not a lot of big surf. Not a lot of other ancillary things that came along with that storm. Big snowmaker, sure. Blizzard of 78 had it all. It had huge waves. It had the really destructive coastline outcomes that we saw with this one. A long laster, the huge snowfall, the power outages, the stranded motorists, everything. It checks all the boxes for a hallmark New England storm. 2,000 homes were destroyed in this blizzard, including the outermost house. Anyone read that book before by Henry Dustin? That's a great one too. It's a good New England read. Out in the outer cape. Life out there is a little bit different, and it was washed away in that storm. The oddball, this is the footprint of the 100-hour storm. So you can see how it really affected New Hampshire and Maine, but also into Essex County at Cape Ann. This was a huge snowmaker here. They had about 100 inches of snow on Mount Washington out of this one, which is remarkable. Even at the base of the mountain, they had 76 inches of snow. And this was Boston's biggest snowstorm until the blizzard of 78. When it came to snowfall here, it's been over 30 inches here in Essex County. I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures from the snow blitz a few years ago. This poor woman was in Hull, and the drifts were substantial during this winter. I remember being in Worcester for one of the last ones of this, and on Valentine's Day weekend, Pete was there. He stopped by our live shop. That was the one with all the thunder snow. I remember Cantori going crazy using Plymouth, and there was lightning after lightning after lightning with it. This was an amazing run. It was a winter that really didn't even get started until January, mid to late January. It got cold in January. It didn't start snowing until the very end. And then it was just ferocious for 4 or 5 weeks in a row. More notable maybe than the snow was the cold, something we don't see a lot of anymore, long stretches of cold. We have very little record cold in New England at this point. We went 43 straight days without reaching 40 degrees, which was very impressive to say the least. We've only had one top 10 coldest month on record in the last 20 years, and it was this month, February of 2015. And in 1717, it was a little bit different. So what we had more recently was a pattern that got stuck, just would not budge. Same thing was going on across all the northern hemisphere. Nothing was moving, so things were just lined up. 1717 was a different time. It was in the Little Ice Age. Certainly was a much colder time. There was a number of large volcanic eruptions around that time. And they reported drifts up to 25 feet high. And some of the similar stories, just seeing houses where there might be a wisp of smoke from the chimney. You didn't see the house otherwise, back in the 1717 run. Then we moved to tropical weather. So in this book, we did major hurricanes, because it's kind of a sample of some of the biggest storms. We've had a lot of tropical systems create a lot of issues for us here, and it doesn't take a hurricane even. So we have seen many tropical storms with flooding issues, but we definitely wanted to get into the real big, rare Category 3 hurricanes, because there are many of them here in New England that make landfall. The last time we had one was almost 70 years ago. It was Carol and Edna. They were back-to-back, back in 1954. Today is the anniversary of the Hurricane 38, which is maybe the worst hurricane to ever hit southern New England. We had a great September gale in 1815 and a great colonial hurricane in 1635. So the return period for these is like 50 to 150 years for Category 3. So everything has to go just right, the slingshot one, into our coastline to make landfall. And that's a picture from Carol. The most recent one, that's in Groton, Connecticut. It made landfall there in the southeastern corner of the state. It was a busy time. If you look at the records across much of the lower 48, you'll tend to find clusters, for whatever reason, that certain places were hit a lot in a certain window of time. Something was going on in the atmosphere during that decade or so where things just wanted to keep happening in the same spot. In Florida, the 40s is a really big time for hurricane landfalls. Terrible time in South Florida. For us, it was the 50s to the early 60s, where we had a number of hurricanes in the area. This one had 135 mile per hour gust on Block Island, big storm surge. Edna was less than 2 weeks later, and one of the more interesting quotes from a guy on Martha's Vineyard, they got the second hurricane, he said, well, it's not so bad because there's nothing else left to destroy. After the first one, the second one was like, well, here we go again, the power's not on yet, so might as well. You might notice, the astute observer here says, okay, we had Carol and then Edna, where's the D storm? Well, the D storm was Dolly, and it was in between them, and it just missed us. So in 12 days, we had 3 powerful hurricanes just offshore, one just barely missing us. We only had 3 in a row hitting New England. This is our anniversary storm, the 38 hurricane. Unique track, kind of like Sandy, like a New England version of Sandy. Something that jammed inland to the left instead of recurving to the right like most storms do. And when you see that track, the strongest winds on a hurricane are on the right side of the path. And they're increased if the storm's moving quickly. It's like relativity. If you were driving down the highway and someone threw a baseball alongside the car, it looks like the baseball's moving slower. But if you're going with it, that relative speed, okay, now the baseball's going faster. If the storm's winds are coming counterclockwise around the storm, that's also the forward motion. Just add the winds to the forward motion. You can see where we were relative to that track. So this was monstrous in terms of tree damage. 5% of all the forests in New England came down in this afternoon. And kind of an equivalent to that is the whole Mount Washington National, or White Mountain National Forest. All that came down in 4 hours. That's how many trees came down during this morning. So this is what keeps us up at night. As forecasters in New England, this will be the next major kind of generational event, when we finally get a Category 3 hurricane, something like this again. We're more forested now than we were then. We have a different type of forest. We're more densely populated. There's a lot that goes into it, but this is going to be a major, major thing. It will happen again. It's just a question of this year, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. How do you prepare for it? Well, you can bury power lines, but that doesn't seem like something that's going to happen because it's very expensive. At least not in any places where you already have above ground. You don't build on the coast. I feel like that's going to happen. So you have supplies. You try to get a generator if you can. You try to have at least some rations, because if we got a storm like this, you would expect some portions of our area would probably be without power for a couple of months. It would be a very long period of time before they could restore it. So these are the types of storms that really just kind of wait to see when it comes back. This had 186 mile per hour gust at Blue Hill Observatory. If you've been there in Milton, there's a plaque outside. It's kind of a lie. They didn't measure it. So that wind gust was based off of the last highest sustained wind they could measure, plus looking at the cloud speed. So they have a formula for watching the cloud speed at a certain level, kind of timing it from Providence to Milton, and then working out how quickly things are moving. So it's a bit of an estimate, because you might say, wait a minute, how come we don't see 186 mile per hour wind gusts recorded now? Or everything loses power, we don't get those big gusts. Well, it didn't work this time either. They had a way of observing it, and that's what they came up with. And then long before that, Great Colonial Hurricane. Since we're here in a book talk, I'm reading Dayflower right now by Daniel Philbridge. It's amazing they made it. That survived, settling here. Just about everything they went through from 1620 up till this point, and then to be hit by one of the worst hurricanes in New England history. It's remarkable that anything really got the ball rolling here in Massachusetts. But this one is interesting because a lot of it came from the diaries of William Bradford, who was governor down there at Plymouth in the Mass Bay Colony, and John Winthrop. They took notes, wind direction, wind speed, talking to local Native Americans, and within those notes, we can kind of infer where this track was. Based on the winds were southeast here, they were northwest here, this is the time of day, and you get a couple of points. As long as you had an observer on Long Island and a couple across Massachusetts, you can kind of pin down where that track will be. Plus, Brown University did a sediment study, which is like an ice core. You go do ice cores up in the Arctic, and they're basically looking at history by taking out that huge tube and looking at the atmospheric composition years back. Well, they can do a sediment core, and you'll see overwash from big storms. So they can look at that and say, okay, here's a storm that's in the 1600s, here's one in the 1700s, and they can see exactly where that overwash occurred. So when they look down, they see this storm. They can see how far inland it went. You can figure out the storm surge. By figuring out the storm surge, you get a really good idea of what the pressure of the storm was and how strong the winds were. So even though this was almost 400 years ago, there are ways to do detective work and kind of reconstruct what the storm was and how strong it was. It might not be to the 5 mile per hour increments that we might have now, but you can get a really good idea because only certain types of storms put 14 to 20 foot storm surge. I should mention the story of Thatcher Island is based off of this one. Thatcher Island is named after Anthony Thatcher, and his whole family, except for him and his wife, were killed. They were out on a boat. They were caught in this. They basically got flung into the ocean and washed up on what is now Thatcher Island. And eventually the state granted them title to that island. So that's how it got its name. All right, another segment, this is kind of dovetails into the tropics, is major flood events. We cover some of the biggest ones here. Irene, the most recent event in Vermont. But it was also very similar to what happened in 1927. So those are the two Green Mountain State floods of note. Then we have the Connie and Diane floods in 55, tropical systems that cause tremendous flooding. And again, an example, we don't need a hurricane to have a really high impact weather event here. And the 1936 Connecticut River flood. This is a quick look at Connie and Diane. A little technical, all you really need to look at are the color bands here. You see across Connie, it's a north-south band of really heavy rainfall. And a lot of that came down in the Berkshires and the Litchfield Hills in Connecticut. And this is a storm that didn't make landfall, wasn't even all that strong, but it put down a lot of rain. Then, fast forward a week, you have Diane. Diane didn't make landfall, but it just paralleled the southern New England coastline from west to east. And so that rain band was west to east as well. And you can see where they overlap out toward western Massachusetts and into western Connecticut. That's where they had the biggest flooding of this. And this was unbelievable event across much of the area. Even to the Blackstone Valley, they had some really significant flooding. They had over 2 feet of rain in Westfield and out of our camps. 2 feet of rain in Florida, you can kind of deal with sandy soil. 2 feet of rain here with some complex terrain is disastrous, and it was. Especially around Torrington, Connecticut, down to a bunch of western Connecticut, all those river valleys, the Housatonic, they all had significant flooding. And this is still the 24-hour rainfall record at the airport at Windsor Locks, Connecticut. We got over a foot of rainfall there. Then we go to Irene, and it's just fascinating how much rain can cause flooding like this. Because if you go again to the southern states, routinely a tropical system might put down 10 to 20 inches of rainfall. Irene was 3 to 8 inches of rain. On the face value, you're like, 3 to 8 inches of rain, it's not that bad. But it had been a very wet summer, the ground was already saturated. Vermont, of course, is very mountainous, and that water gets a lot of velocity, so it does not take as much rainfall to create flooding like this. Almost every town in Vermont reported damage from this storm. 3,500 businesses were lost. A number of covered bridges were wiped out during this. And again, the wet summer really primed the damage that we saw during Irene. And then we go into 27, which is a little bit different because it was in November. It wasn't a tropical system. But the thing that they share in common is that it was wet leading up to the event. So sometimes what precedes a storm is just as important as the storm itself. Then we do a few of the tornadoes. There are a lot of interesting tornadoes in New England. We did the deadliest and the most costly. And ones that look like a Kansas or an Alabama type, they do happen around here, that being the Worcester Tornado in the upper left. And then the Windsor Locks Tornado, which is the costliest around here, because it hit the airport and the Air Museum. So a lot of very expensive things in the way of that tornado. And they're very different tornadoes. The Worcester Tornado was a classic supercell, hot day, humidity coming down out of the Berkshires, spins up heading into Worcester County, and you can see it for miles away. Windsor Locks was a cool, rainy, 60-degree October day. I mean, you would not be thinking big tornado day. But it was just riding a warm front, and then came right into downtown Windsor Locks. And that's what radar looked like during the Worcester Tornado. It's a little different than now. This is a research radar with MIT, but you can still see a little hook echo there. So it did pick that up. And this, unfortunately, hit Worcester during its kind of peak of population. So it was very densely populated at this time, and you usually don't have tornadoes come through a large city. It does happen, of course. 4,000 buildings were destroyed there. It was the first time they ever issued a severe thunderstorm warning. It's such a different time to think of, because now we would have severe weather outlooks days in advance. The day of, we'd have tornado watches. Then you'd have tornado warnings, and we'd be cutting it on TV all day long, and you'd be waiting for the tornado by the time the tornado can it just hit me, please? I want to stop talking about it. With this, they didn't want to use the word tornado because they thought it would create panic. They did talk about it. They thought it was a setup where there could be one. It was taboo to mention tornado, so they didn't. And they did eventually issue a tornado warning on this, but it had already lifted by the time they did. So, although some tornado warnings don't verify now, we're fortunate to have them. This was an F4 and very close to F5 status. Winds over 200 miles per hour. Some of the debris from this fell across Cape Cod. So it gets carried so high up in the atmosphere, the winds keep blowing it off to the east. And there's a couple of other large tornadoes to go along with this as it made its way eastbound. And the Worcester Tornado, again, damp October day, warm fronts coming up the Connecticut River Valley, but ends up being one of the top 10 costliest tornadoes on record because of where it hit. And it also was an F4, so not just a tornado on an unusual day, but a really strong tornado on an unusual day. I'm almost done running on here, but you can ask all sorts of questions, by the way. We did do a little bit of summer. There are some hazards, although summer is kind of our nice season here in New England. We do get heat waves and we do get wildfires. We used to get more of them, but now a little bit more of forestry service and fire prevention. We don't have the big fires for the most part that we had in the past. And I always think this is an interesting tidbit. Of all of these storms you can think of, everything you talk about here, the hurricanes and the floods, the deadliest natural disaster in New England history is a heat wave in 1911, of all times. Over 2,000 people killed during this heat wave. We had 100-degree temperatures for several days in a row. And it was in early July. Got up to 106 in Nashville at 104 Boston, which is still the record for Boston. All time, 104 is the hottest that it's been in the city. And you see there people camping out on the common. They opened up Boston Common for people to just sleep outside. But there's air conditioning around. It was hard to even get ice in 1911. So there wasn't much you could do about it. One thing that always strikes me about the pictures, look how much clothing people are still wearing. No wonder 2,000 people died. I mean, not to make light of it, but now it's hot, and wear shorts and a tank top. Everyone's still wearing their hats, and the pants, and the suspenders, and their shirts. So again, just a different time. And then we talk about the biggest fires. In 1947, we featured a major wildfire outbreak in Maine. It was titled "The Year Maine Burned." And this really changed a couple different things about Maine. One, Bar Harbor. Huge fire. They had called it the Dunkirk of Bar Harbor because there's only one road in. If you ever made the trip up there, or you take a boat. And there's ash and flames coming down on the road. Some people did go that way, but a lot of people brought as many ships in as they could, and people were evacuated by ship out into the Atlantic. It was the only way to get away from the fire that was burning down from town Acadia. And this was a really unusually hot and dry stretch that caused this. As the fire broke out, Portland had 7 days in the 80s during October. Some parts of Maine without rainfall for over 3 months straight. Not any rain at all. And it was when the winds picked up here in mid-October that these fires really started to spread into the thing. Southern York County also had a huge fire, and it burned down pretty much all of Kennebunkport except for the commercial district. It just missed that beautiful little downtown in Kennebunkport. But essentially everything north of there to the water was burned. So everything there is built post this wildfire. It went right to the ocean before it stopped. And there's 20,000 firefighters that volunteered for that. And it burned so much up in Acadia, around Cadillac Mountain, that if you go now, you see the nice fall colors. A lot of that is a result of deciduous trees growing in the wake of the fire instead of pine trees or evergreen trees. Almost through. Coastal storms got their own categories. They're not quite hurricanes, they're not quite blizzards, there's something in between. We often see them in the cold season, usually between October and April. But they can cause a lot of damage, a lot of destruction, erosion along the coastline. They can really change the face of our coastline. The perfect storm is the great example of that. A storm that if you were 10 miles inland to Massachusetts, you probably didn't think anything of. But if you're along the coast or have friends at the coast, totally different story. Especially with the sinking of the Andrea Gale 6 aboard. A big story that came out of this one. We got a wave height of 100 feet that was recorded south of Nova Scotia. See if we can give that a run for its money with the owner later this week. And it had a tropical connection. So it started as basically a nor'easter, and then it absorbed Hurricane Grace, which was a small hurricane way out to the east. And then it kind of was sliding down the coast. The hurricane went away, but then as it started to leave, another hurricane popped and formed. You can see how it's sitting kind of right in the middle here. One more thing, sorry. But at the very end, we call it the no-name hurricane because the hurricane center didn't want a name. We didn't want to scare people or didn't make them think that another storm was coming. It would be confusing because they already had the storm they're talking about, but if they gave it a name, then, oh, there's a hurricane now, where's the hurricane going? So they just let it go. because they knew it was going out to sea. But that name is still in rotation. It would have been Henri, which we just had last year. Big anniversary coming up on this one, the Portland Gale, November 25th of 1898. We're actually planning to go out as a group with NOAA that are sending a rover back down to the bottom to the shipper, which is off the Provincetown. We're going to go out with them for that project. This is a really odd story because most everyone was coming back in or staying in harbor, but this one captain just kept going. There were ships on his way out who were basically flashing lights saying, "What are you doing?" Kept going. Came right out past Boston Light, and that was that. They said, off to the east of Boston. Everyone was lost on board. 150 ships were also destroyed along with this one. They didn't find the exact location of the wreck until pretty recently. This is right after they were doing all that work to find the Titanic. They ended up finding this with similar technology. But one thing about this storm, it was also a major early season snowstorm. It's still the biggest snowstorm so early in the season for New York and Boston and Worcester. Here, basically a Thanksgiving snowstorm that put down over a foot of snow in a lot of spots. You might be thinking, okay, what about that Snowtober storm we had in 2011? Boston didn't get any snow from that. It was all inland. And Worcester was focused basically a little bit north of Worcester and some of the biggest snowfall totals. They were getting 18 there, and New York didn't get a foot. So now we're on to the takeaway portion of all this. And in research, what really stuck out to me was that almost all of these led to some big change. It was a light bulb moment where someone said, what we're doing isn't working, and we need to do it differently. We need to fix our systems, we need to fix our technology or our infrastructure. You look at the Worcester Tornado, right after that they started CELS, which is the now Storm Prediction Center, a centralized location to forecast strictly severe weather. And they, right after this, rolled out radar to monitor rain, storms, severe weather. So this was a bad year for tornadoes. So they said, okay, we're going to do this differently. We're going to really focus on it. Immediate change. In 1947, with Maine burning, they started a new firefighting agency to monitor and fight wildfires along with Canada. That agency still exists today. The floods that we had, the 36 flood, the 38 flood, 55 floods, these all led to more and more of the Army Corps engineers having projects to control water so that we don't see those types of floods as much as we used to in the past. We look at Carol, led to the National Hurricane Center. This was a bad year too, 54. We had Carol, we had Edna, we also had Hazel, which was a big East Coast hurricane that year. And right after that, they centralized a location in Miami, which is still the Hurricane Center today. Carol was also the first retired storm king. They had already had several Carols, but we've seen enough Carol. They got rid of Carol. And now we retire names all the time. And 1888, the blizzard there, which was really bad in New York City, and it was pretty bad in Boston as well, it jump-started the creation of the subway systems. A few years later, they opened up the first subways because it was such an ungodly mess trying to get around. These major cities said we have to have a way to keep things moving that's not subject to whatever's happening at the surface. And now we know how wonderfully it works. A question that you might ask is how will climate change affect the future? For me, I think the biggest issue for us in New England is water, both from heavy precipitation events and from sea level rise. I think those are the two things that really we see the most in the data. Sea level rise is something that we've seen about a foot, a little over a foot in Boston over the last 100 years. You do notice more sunny day flooding. You do notice that the water's coming up in places more frequently than it used to. We had a record high water level just a few years ago from a storm that beat out the blizzard of 78, but wasn't as strong as the blizzard of 78. And part of that is sea level rise. It's just easier to hit some of these high water marks. We have lower confidence on things like severe storms and tropical cyclones. What's the relationship? How it will change? There's not a lot of compelling data in terms of severe storms. What's going on there? We're seeing more of them. They're creeping in a certain direction. A little bit of a northward creep, but it's not something that we're positive is going to keep going in the future. And the tropical cyclones, a lot of the research for years has said there might be fewer, but the ones that we have more capacity to create more rainfall and a higher capacity to rapidly intensify, which is a little bit of a conundrum. And then decreasing severe cold is the most obvious. There's just a lot less of it to go around. We still have cold stretches for sure, and even really meaningful ones, but in terms of how is it weighed, we see a lot more warm records than cold records by a long shot now. And that's a look at some of the things that are in the book and a few of the highlights. But usually at this point, I like to stop talking, and I'm sure you've been thinking about things or thinking about dinner or what you're going to do this weekend. So you can ask me some questions, and we'll just let you have the rest of the night here, the rest of our time.
How do you know what's going to happen in 10 days?
How do we know? We hope we know. We think we know. But how do we make our educated guesses? We use computer models. It's a huge help. Computer models are something that Don Kent wasn't able to use. You make a good 1 to 3 day forecast, but after 3, things get a little squirrely without the help of some of these models. It's tough to figure out where you're going. A 10-day forecast is still nothing to bank on. A 10-day forecast is more about trends. 7 to 10 days from now, does it look warmer than average, colder than average, wetter, drier, stormier? Is there something that's really lurking in this pattern that looks like it'll breed more storms or tropical weather, tropical threats? So it's more about ideas than it'll be 83 and afternoon thunderstorms on day 10. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. Certain patterns are easier than others. Some are a complete mess. But those computer models really can help us out. We look at a range of different ones. When I'm looking out more than, say, 5 or 7 days, we use ensembles. Ensembles are basically like they're your family. You're all blood, you're in the same family, but you all have little different personalities. You're all just a little bit different. So the ensembles take the same family, same model, and then they take all the little different personalities, which are basically slightly different initial conditions, and then they run it out, and we see what happens. If they're all in really good agreement, you have a higher confidence, this is how things look like, how it's going to play out. If they're all over the place, then you're like, well, it seems like this could go in a lot of different directions, so we're not very confident in the longer range forecasts. And again, some patterns are easier than others. Then when we get closer, we use what are called operational models. There's a few of those around that we can use. They give you answers. They're all wrong, but they can be useful. We say all models are wrong, but some are useful. So our job is to basically look at all that data and say, given what I know and my experience doing this and looking at what's going on, what's the most likely outcome here, and then it's to communicate to you what we think is going to happen. And then when we get really close, we have what we call high-resolution models, and that's for very fine details. Like we had that big rainfall storm the other a couple weeks ago. They did a really good job of nailing that 4 to 8 inch area, really heavy rainfall, which usually a global model, an operational model that we might use for that forecast. It'll show a blob of rain, but it's not going to get those small details. When you get within 2 days, we use those high-res models to try to figure out, okay, the storms look like they'll fizzle before they hit the North Shore. We get bullseye over Providence, or a tornado looks likely on the Cape. So those things come into focus in the last 2 days usually.
Who makes the call for your station as far as, because you're all going to have the same forecast. Is it you as the chief meteorologist that makes that, this is what we're going to go with tomorrow for our forecast? Or?
Everyone really has their own autonomy. It can change a little bit from shift to shift. It depends. I would imagine if you shopped around enough and you looked at different people, you might notice some stations are very different from morning to night. Sometimes it's a personality thing, honestly. All forecasters are different, and sometimes they look at different things, they feel differently, they have different outlooks on weather. They might craft it differently. Some are very standardized. The time that we collaborate the most is snow. So when we get into winter, and we're talking snow totals, and we're all watching the models, we have a Slack channel where we're all going in and kind of sharing our thoughts, and we try to not change things significantly unless it really calls for it, because we don't want things to move around a lot shift to shift. So we do collaborate and try to come up with, we all feel good about this range, this is what we're putting out there, and go from there. Because I don't want the morning to say 2 to 4 and then not roll into the afternoon and go 8 to 12. It's not easy for the viewers, and it's not a good look for us either.
That's on 10.
Yeah.
2 to 4 and you get 2 feet.
Yeah, I mean, weather's still very humbling. do not go into weather if you don't like being wrong. It will be wrong. It will happen. It's just, it is what it is. It's predicting the future.
2 questions. First, can you go through a typical day from like you're feeding the kids in the morning, getting to work at the end, and then switching to major storms, historic, Fiona, Newfoundland coming up, thoughts on that area that's, you know, at least if you look at the models, it's going to be pretty bad.
Yeah, it's a good question. So a typical day, the first thing I do, sadly, in the morning is look at computer models. They're not the fun models. They're just web models.
Yeah.
And I look to see if anything changed. I don't like ever being caught off guard. I do a lot of social media, so if someone asks me a question, I don't know what I'm talking about. So that's the first thing that I will do. And then my wife will put the baby on the bed and say, here you go. And she goes to work, and I take over, and I bring the boys to school. And once get some things settled in the house, I'll usually go to the gym. And then I'll talk with work if we're planning a live shot, or if it's a busy weather day, you know, we're coordinating things. If I'm at the gym and it's busy, then we're definitely looking at models the whole time and answering questions, all of that. I go to work around 2. I leave for work at 2 in the afternoon. And then once we're in, it's forecasting first, and then building all the graphics that you see, talking to producers. Here's the story today. Here's how you should write it. We tape promos and things like that. We're on from 5 to 6:30. Then we tape until 7. Then we're on from 8 till 9. We tape again. We tape at 9:30. And we're on 10 to 11:30. So it has become a lot of talking. Coming here might actually be less talking than talking at work. And I would imagine we'll probably out of 4 o'clock newscast before too long, just because we're the last station standing with that one. I can't last for too long. So it's busy. It's very busy. I'm not very good at separating work from being home, so I'm always kind of keeping an eye on things, trying to answer questions. As for Fiona, yeah, bad storm toward Cape Breton. Could be one of their worst on record. Could actually shatter some of the low pressure records in Nova Scotia this weekend, Saturday. So that will be, it's an example, you know, you have to be on guard up here. Even though we're far north and they're farther north than us, these storms can still pack a punch. A common theme of big tropical storms, holding on to hurricane strength, moving fast. All of our big hits, they're all fast moving hurricanes. Anything slow is not going to be a major hurricane up here, because it's going to get close to land, it's going to interact with land, the jet stream, cooler water, it's not going to be able to hold on to it. But this one will be rocking. We had Dorian a few years ago, which was a really bad storm up there, and Juan several years ago. That was another very bad storm in Halifax. This one looks like it'll be a little bit east of Halifax, which would be good news, at least for that. Winds over 100 miles an hour. That'll be bad news.
So two questions. Online, streaming, there is a plethora of the next generation of weather reporters. These people are afforded time. They can broadcast during severe weather events hours from their home studios. They have all the screens, all the spaghetti models, and all the ensembles and all that. And they can go into detail. They're taking Twitter feeds, how soon before this hits me, and it's very real time. And again, they're afforded hours. 2 questions. So one, what do you think is the future of weather reporting? Is it headed more in a streaming online format? And my second question is kind of a silly question, but if you could hop in your DeLorean and travel back to the future and broadcast live from any of the storms you talked about, or any other storm, what storm and why?
Good questions. For your first question, yes, streaming is where we're at. We've had a 24-hour streaming service for a couple of years now, and they're just dedicating more and more to that. And part of the reason that even when we're not on BZ, we're usually on the stream. Though during winter storms, even if we come off the network, we're on CBS News Boston through our website or our app. Whenever I mean, we don't let it get old on the stream at all. If there's anything going on, we don't let it go more than an hour without an update to it. So it's definitely where everything's going. It's just being there whenever people need to find information and keeping it updated. You can't just do 6 and 11 anymore. It doesn't work. So the stream is very important for us. I know it's a major priority for the network as well. As for a storm, any of these storms, I would like to be in a major hurricane in New England right now. I'd pick something like 38 to see what that looked like, just because I have no experience. I mean, last time we even had a hurricane, I was basically a kid. That was just barely a hurricane compared to some of these other ones. So, yeah, I think I would like to see what that was like. And just to think, would you also come at it from that time, or would you bring your future self to the past? Because if you look at a storm like 38, people just walked out the door. They didn't have a clue that one of the worst storms in the history of the region was going to hit them that day. Imagine walking out of your house right now and not even having a clue that a hurricane was going to hit in a few hours. I mean, it's hard to fathom. Hard to wrap your head around now. That type of a storm, we'd be tracking for 10 days. So I would be interested to see what that feels like, to just be totally blindsided by something and not know about it. So now we almost know too much. Yeah, it takes me the surprise out of things. Although there are definitely still surprises.
Eric, was there any particular major weather event in your career that posed the most challenge to forecast, that perhaps caused you the most anxiety?
Without a doubt, because you're not forecasting the snow. I mean, if you forecast showers and you get a 1/10 of an inch rain shower or a 4/10 of an inch rain shower, you don't care. It rained. There was a rain shower. A 1/10 of an inch to 4/10 of an inch of moisture in snow could be 2 inches to 8 inches. And 8 inches, people get really angry. And 2 inches, they don't. So there's a lot of pressure on it. People lose their minds over snow. A lot of plans change, cancellations happen. I feel like everything gets canceled now. I'm not telling you to cancel, but everyone cancels. It's just a very stressful time for me. By the time March comes around, we are all toast in the run office. Especially now because everything is streaming. Whenever there's anything winter weather related, we're just on all day. So it's just a different experience. I mean, Barry would tell you, Barry Burbank, that, when he was forecasting snowstorms, it was just exciting. So you watch the snow, and then, you go out at 6, like, it's snowing waffles outside. And then you hang out and have dinner and watch it snow, and then at 11, you're like, it's still snowing, and there's your day. It's kind of a grind now, to be honest. I'm actually looking forward to the day, although it's still quite a few many years in the future, that I'll just sit with a glass of wine and watch it blizzard. That sounds awesome. I'll be a huge fan of winter again when that happens. But for now, that's the most stressful. We just spend all day, I'm sitting at my computer, just moving lines 2 miles, like, oh, should I go to 495, or should I might have to make sure I get the tip of Cape Ann, because Pete will be like, well, is that real? Is that happening? Cape Ann, because it's a very different world out there, a little tip into the ocean. So, although a lot of things are automated now, I hand draw a lot of our products, and so there's a lot of handwriting that goes into that.
And dovetailing on that, any insight to what this winter looks like? Do you care to elaborate?
The winter, we usually do our outlook in November. It's hard to even really say so early like this, because a lot of the things that we might look at, we're not there yet. We're not even at the time of the year where you're looking for some of those hints. I wouldn't trust any computer models this far out, because it's just too far down the road. And then we look for things like snow cover extents. How quickly does it grow in October across Asia and Siberia? We look at how what sea ice is doing. We look at how November is trending, because that tends to be a bellwether month. That relationship has kind of led us astray recently. There's some things that we look at in October in particular where we start to dig in on that. So I don't really have a strong feeling yet as to what's going to happen.
Read the phone song.
They always say it's going to be snowy.
I
Probably, it'll snow and it will be cold. That will verify. It'll always be dark, it'll always snow, it'll always be cold, it's just a question of how much of each.
I actually do have a question. I was born in '55 and I was named after Carol, the
Really?
But it seems like when you think back, I don't know if it's that you're thinking back as a child in New England, but it always seems like there was more snow. Is the snow really?
Totally.
It really is.
But it really isn't, actually.
It
It's
is.
actually more so than that.
Oh, there is, okay. It's
So-
not really-
I think the character has changed, because I feel the same way, you know, as a kid, everything's huge. And now, I think the character of our winters have changed. Winter is our fastest warming season, so we've seen the biggest warming taking place during the cold season. And so that has certainly changed how we look at things, but we haven't seen a decrease in average snowfall. It's basically stayed the same or even increased an inch or two, if you look at the averages. It's funny that we think of these times that were very snowy, because the 80s were the least snowiest decade on record. I remember snow. It snowed quite a bit. But now we get things in close. More than ever before, we're getting snowfall in bigger amounts when it snows. Much like when we get rainfall, when it rains, we're having heavier downpours. And it takes very little extra moisture to create more snow. So I think if you're a snow lover, you're still getting big storms. And in fact, you might be getting bigger storms or more snow in a clump. To me, it's more of a story of retention. So last year, we had this huge snowstorm, gone in 6 days. It was in the top 5 of biggest Boston snowfalls, and it didn't make it a week, and it was gone. Last winter, although Boston ended up a few inches above average for snow, we didn't have snow on the ground for 20 days, the entire season. It basically snowed 3 times. We had a good snowfall in early January. That melted in 2 days. Then we had the snow, big blizzard that melted in 6 days. And then we had snow in February, and that lasted 7 days. And there wasn't much else for the entire season. So I feel like a lot of these winters, almost every year seems to have a big storm, at least one. But in terms of long duration snow on the ground, there are exceptions. 2014 and 15, certainly. We had a good stretch in 2018, and we had a good stretch in 2013-14. That was a real classic winter. But a lot of them recently, the warm-ups have kind of done away with these long stretches where you're looking out the window and seeing snow covered in grass. I think that changes winter for me. I mean, last year, I didn't go snowshoeing last winter. It was like, okay, I have this 5-6 day window, there's snow on the ground, and then it was gone. I never had a chance, I never got out. So, in terms of enjoying it, it's become a little bit trickier, even if the snow on paper is the same or even a little bit more. I don't know if you feel the same way. Does everyone feel the same way?
Do you think that it's shifted from, like, we're not getting as many white Christmases anymore, so to speak. Most of us are looking at it and saying, oh, well, we won't get snow until in the clumps until like January or in that bigger, in that 3-month span.
Yeah, in recent times, things all feel like they've been pushed forward a month. You know, it seems like September has been, well, this September has been on the cooler side, so that's been kind of nice. But on the average, we've seen summer kind of lasting a little bit longer. December's kind of become a glorified fall month, just really dark. Although, we've had a couple of good snowfalls. But a lot of the action's been in January, February, March. So we've seen a little bit of a push down the calendar a little bit, for sure. Yeah, we've christened the Santa Torch. Is the name for the inevitable warm pattern that shows up around Christmas, which seems like we've had almost every year in the last decade or so. And then January, February, and March really have taken off on us. Even in April, we've had snow quite a few years recently. Yeah.
Yeah, so 2 things actually. One was October's coming up. It's becoming notorious for getting end of the month big coastal storms. I don't know if you see anything, that cycle pattern that we're in right now. As you were saying, how hurricanes will happen, but we don't know when. So what kind of cycle would you say that we're in right now? For instance, that we're going through. We're not like we're in this 50, 60 cycle. We're in the 22nd century, 21st century. It's been a long time, so we've been 33 years drought or a hurricane direct hit, or
31.
New England, almost 31.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So we're getting to that stage where it starts to, get a little,
It's gotta change.
it's got to change eventually, right? So what are you seeing as far as cycles go? And I know people talk about, my other question was, I know, I'm not a believer in climate change, but I do, I've seen data that has the water rising and all that, the way the weather patterns over the water, I'm trying to figure it out, the water pattern from the North Atlantic Oscillation, okay? So I seen that, so I get that. But what does that have to do with our, the cycles that we go through every 50, 60, 70 years?
The way I see it is that the cycles are so overlaid with a different basin. So you still have the cycles that happen throughout our climate on decadal scales or even longer. They're just superimposed over a warmer basin, if that makes sense. So you can still be in the same type of a stretch or regime, just to be a little warmer probably than what we had back in the past. In terms of what we're in now, I wouldn't say I'm like an expert in decadal climate patterns. If you're asking about this year, then I do feel a little bit differently about this fall than many other recent falls. I feel like this fall is going to be on the cooler side compared to a lot of the warm ones we've had recently. I think it's going to get pretty stormy. So I think that we are going to start really chewing away at our rainfall deficits from this summer. And then we'll see if it lasts heading into the winter time. We're kind of looking into October. We've had these really warm falls in the last few years. And I'm not getting that sense for this one. I feel like it's going to be on the cooler and stormier side. We'll start getting some more water around here, which has already started. I think that'll continue to be a theme. And then we'll see if the tropics, seems like it'll be a back half season this year.
Do you see the tropics moving through October longer? Do you see that lasting longer?
Yeah, I think they're going to
Some of
stay
the experts
pretty busy now.
Scientists are thinking.
But one of the big, remember in the beginning of the season, the outlook was for a busy hurricane season. We'll see how much above average, if we get above average, we end up. We've got a couple of months to go still, so certainly we can stack up a bunch of storms in a hurry. One of the theories about why it's been so quiet at this point, one being there's been a lot of dust, an unusual amount of dust coming off the back of it this year, which has really capped a lot of the Atlantic. Dust is stable, kind of puts the kibosh on any cloud storm development. The other thing that we've seen is that there's a big ongoing marine heat wave across the North Atlantic. And it's been relatively cooler in the main development region and with La Nina as well. Basically that whole band across has had cooler water. So if you think about it, normally you look at the ocean, all the water's up top, warmer water's down south. This is a little bit cooler, this is warmer, we're shrinking that difference. So you have a smaller temperature difference from south to north. What's the job of a hurricane? It's to move heat around. If you have less of a gradient, there's less of a need for the Earth to start moving some of that heat around. Now what happens as you get deeper into the fall time is that you're really cooling off the North Atlantic waters faster because you're starting to lose a lot of daylight in a hurry. They tend to cool off quickly, while the equator, equatorial waters, they're going to stay warmer or at least the same longer. Now you're increasing the instability between those two layers again. And now the Earth system might say, okay, we've got to start displacing some of this heat, moving it around a little bit. So that might be one reason why we are going to see more of a back half hurricane season this year. Those ocean water patterns are really important for us when we try to figure out what's going to happen, whether it be winter, a hurricane season, or really any other kind of forecast. There's a lot of clues there in the ocean. Are we good? Do we max out? Is everyone hungry?
Eric, I just have a quick comment. And thank you for coming out here today. I'm going to buy your book and enjoy your presentations. I'm a retired researcher, and when I did research, we would generate data, study the data, do more experiments, look at the data again, polish it up, give it out for presentations, publish it, and then basically we don't stand up in front of a large audience night after night and look at data that are fluid and volatile and dynamic. And so whenever I hear somebody say, well, we didn't get that rain that Eric talked about, or we didn't get the snowstorm that he mentioned, I never believe those meteorologists. They're just talking, they don't know what they're talking about. I go, when was the last time you stood up there and looked at data in real time with all the different courses and tried to make the best guess about what's going to happen. And so I just want to know that I have your back. I have all your back. Because I do think it's
So who are
really
those
tough
people? Well, you know, it's like anything, right? I mean, we all coach the Patriots every weekend. We don't know how to coach the Patriots. So you do your best to try to go about your specialty, and you're not going to be right all the time. So you just can't go into it thinking you're right all the time, because it's an impossible thing for any field. No one is right all the time. So we try the best we can, and we try to deliver in a way that's useful for everyone who's watching, so hopefully they can go about their business and plan their days. And that's our goal. And then if screw up, we say, screwed up. We move on. People seem to appreciate that. If there's something that really doesn't happen the way it thought, you go on and say, totally blew it. Here's why. You went, okay. And then you move on to the next thing.
To be fair, you got most of the last winter right.
Most of last winter was pretty good. There's that February snow, the Super Bowl snow. I didn't like that one. Just kept snowing. It was actually not far down the street. It was a ski ground for my son. I was like, huh. There's a lot of snow coming down right now. Yeah, sometimes the atmosphere just throws you those curveballs. Best you can.
Yeah, no storm's the same, so you
No.
guys are on air doing the broadcast.
All different.
I miss something,
Yeah.
Mother Nature just fool you.
Yeah, and Mother Nature's in control. We're not in control. We're just trying to manage expectations when it comes to the weather. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me up here. My Storms looks like this. It's at a number of local bookstores. If you haven't grabbed it, I certainly appreciate it. And Amazon has it as well, although I always kind of put the nod to the local bookstores first if you get a chance.
You could probably mail it.
Yeah.